All right, so our final event today is our 5G panel, and I wanted to continue with some of the interesting insights, both on perspective and expectations around 5G. So I'll start by welcoming our panel here. It's a distinctive panel who has a very wide spectrum of background and vantage points related to national security issues. So we'll engage our panel and to really discover a bit more about their thoughts and ideas on how 5G influences their operations and plans and responsibilities in the coming years. So let me start by just doing a quick introduction of the folks on the panel so that you have an understanding of their backgrounds and expertise. Representing the Border Patrol's operational side, we are honored to welcome Deputy Chief Raul Ortiz. Thank you. Deputy Chief Ortiz's career has spanned over 28 years, and he's performed several leadership roles, notably as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy to Afghanistan and Pakistan for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And in 2019, he became and is now a Chief Patrol Agent of the Del Rio sector for the Border Patrol. Welcome, Chief Ortiz, and thanks for being part of our panel. Following that, I would like to introduce Daniel Kroese. Daniel is CISA's Deputy Assistant Director for the National Risk Management Center. In his leadership role within the NRMC and CISA, he focuses on public-private partnerships to enhance cybersecurity and infrastructure resilience. And at the NRMC, he's actively involved in information and communications technology, supply chain risk management efforts, 5G security and resilience initiatives, and the launch of national critical functions to constructs to evolve understanding of cross-cutting risk to critical infrastructure. And welcome, Mr. Kroese. Following that, we have Travis Russell, representing our industry and as our discussion partner from Oracle. Mr. Russell has been in telecommunications for more than 35 years with experience in radio, voice, and data networking. And as a cybersecurity professional and technologist, Mr. Russell has a long career focused in telecommunications, cybersecurity, and fraud. He participates in a number of important standards bodies and trade organizations and is currently the chair for the FCC Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, Working Group 3, which is focused on security. Welcome, Mr. Russell.
Thanks, Dustin.
So let's kind of get things rolling here. As you saw from the polling, we've got a fair level of interest. In fact, some folks are actually in the planning stages of rolling out some form of 5G into their agencies or their different groups. So I wanted to initially look at some of the key focus areas that Deputy Commissioner Perez detailed earlier. So let's talk around some of the new opportunities enabled by 5G. And as leaders of your organizations, you're each sort of tasked with being the strategic thinkers and how you relate your organizations to operate in the coming months or years. So let's just kind of go into what, if any, has 5G kind of influenced that vision and how are you thinking about that? So let's start with you, Deputy Chief Ortiz. What do you think as far as 5G impacting the agents in the field?
So first off, thank you, Dustin and Megan and the team for allowing us to, sort of present, our border perspective. As you mentioned, 29 plus years working mostly on the southwest border, but a couple of tours in Afghanistan. And I can tell you that the key for success in any border environment is our ability to communicate and understanding what's happening at any given point, whether it's the 2,000 miles on the southwest border, whether it's our coastal border or our northern border. And so both Chief Scott and I are very focused on doing everything we can to illuminate what's happening out there. And so we talk a lot about situational awareness as we look to, expand our infrastructure and our technology portfolio. I can tell you that 5G is going to play an integral part in all of that. So when you think about, our ability to perform our mission in these very remote areas, whether it's in Arizona or Texas or up on the northern border, it really is important, for one, that our agents are able to gain as much information as they can as to what's happening in that border environment. And so we are currently leveraging several things that are very important that we haven't used previously. So when you think about the linear ground detection system that we're installing with our wall system out there, I think that's going to be a game changer for us. When you think about these autonomous surveillance towers that we're installing in West Texas and South Texas and in El Paso, I think, once again, also, that's going to allow us to shrink that border. We've always talked about that with 19,555 Border Patrol agents, that's not enough to cover, the 8,600 miles of border that we have to cover. And so, how do we ensure that we can have visibility on what's happening and still make sure that our workforce is safe? I think one of the other things that has happened and what we've seen recently between COVID, the civil unrest, is that our ability to communicate and be agile and mobile very quickly in locations is very, very important to us. When you think about the Border Patrol, a lot of people think, well, you're a border security agency or you're an immigration agency. But I think, as one of your previous panelists mentioned, the way CBP looks at border security, it's national security. So whether it's responding to a hurricane, we've had, 15 major hurricanes or 5 major hurricanes, 15 hurricanes this season, whether it's responding to civil unrest in Portland or in Oregon, or, just helping out another agency with wildfires. I think it's important that we were able to put something in the hands of our agents, our frontline agents or officers out there, so they can communicate and get as much intelligence or information, and then be able to share that with their partners out there in the field. So I think, when you think about 5G and where we're going, I think the sky's the limit. And I'm really excited. And we're really looking at our Invent team and some of the other groups out there to bring us, hey, what is industry looking at right now? What are we leveraging with our DoD partners that we can perhaps deploy in a border environment? When we talk about technology, we really are thinking 5 and 10 years out. We're not really thinking about what we're doing right now. We're thinking about what our border environment is going to look like in 2025 and beyond.
Excellent. Thank you, Deputy Chief. I completely understand your sort of very focused vision as far as 5G's got a lot of interesting capabilities to expand upon where your needs go. To move on to an interesting other aspect to this. So if you look at where CISA is, and it's sort of neck deep in the sort of 5G experience, if you will, and has a lot of responsibilities around we as a nation. Daniel, what do you think the activities or programs within your organization that are being influenced by the 5G development now, and where are kind of things going in the coming years?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. Great question. Really impacts almost every aspect of CISA right now. When you look at the CISA mission space, we have a broad cybersecurity mandate as the lead civilian cybersecurity agency. We have another role where we act as a storefront or a conduit, if you will, to the broader critical infrastructure community. And so have a nice perch, strategic perch there, looking at top of 16 critical infrastructure sectors to understand their risk management needs, allows us to stitch together a holistic national risk picture from that, tease out insights. So when I look across both of those buckets, cybersecurity mission and then a critical infrastructure resilience mission, what is the common denominator increasingly across all that? It really is as simple as data integrity. And the reality is that we live in this complicated, interconnected systems of systems world right now, where whether it's the operational functionality that depends on packets of data for real-time operation, operational considerations of critical infrastructure functions, phones working, lights being on, or it's data at rest, whether it's personally identifiable information, intellectual property, things that need to be stored, digital crown jewels. All that is just part of one increasingly interconnected data integrity problem that relies on a broad universe of information communication technology and services to enable that functionality. 5G is the new shiny object in terms of the next evolution of that piping that underpins all that. And so it really demands a whole society, whole government approach to make sure that the opportunities are leveraged and then the risk management challenges are mitigated. I think what's really cool about this discussion here today is that this is a border security symposium with a portion on 5G. It's not the other way around. And I think that really reinforces the power and the necessity to focus on the use cases of 5G. Like many of you all, I have been at dozens, if not 100 plus different forums that are very much centered around vendor considerations in 5G. And make no mistake, the US government stands by our risk management decisions and perspectives when it comes to untrusted Chinese vendors and all that. So don't need to go into detail on that today. We stand firmly behind those risk management decisions. But just vendor trust is not a silver bullet. It's maturing the use case to understand when the rubber physically hits the road, as just was being talked about on the border in terms of the thermal imaging and autonomous vehicles. Do we understand the unique characteristics and aspects of those 5G deployments in terms of the spectrum, the latency considerations, and so on, to ensure that the promise is realized? And so from the CISA vantage point, it's looking across 16 different sectors that all have different flavors of implementation challenges and getting ahead of that. So we're not just talking about vendor decision and security today. Those are important considerations, but we're also thinking through the operationalization of how when the rubber hits the road, we'll realize the potential here.
No, that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought up essentially the conversation around data integrity and some of the requirements around use case optimization. How do you consider it as a whole, as an end-to-end application, and kind of working through the constraints there and the requirements? To pivot to you, Travis, I think it might be interesting for you to lend some perspective from your industry side, your position there in terms of how is industry working through these types of considerations or concerns with respect to obviously security implications, and then the applications, and how do you create that level of assurance using a kind of industry standard technology?
Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, so a couple of things. First, when we talk about 5G, everybody immediately assumes 5G is the next evolution of wireless technology. And in reality, 5G is such a departure from anything that we have done in cellular industry ever, right? It's not the next evolution of 4G. And in fact, 5G does not care if you use cellular or satellite or Wi-Fi or broadband. We've got networks in Germany that are using fiber optics and no cellular connectivity to connect into the 5G network. That's really a big game changer for the industry. And Dan, you're absolutely correct when we say you got to think of the use cases, right? The value in 5G is not in the network connectivity. The value that 5G brings to the table is that I can use any media type or any access type to reach that network. And 5G, the core network of 5G, provides us some additional capabilities for managing the billions of things that we're going to connect out there. But still, the value is not there. The value is in the applications that we have to reach for each of these different use cases. And that's why you're starting to see this migration where you have hyperscalers like ourselves that are getting into the business of 5G, because all of the applications reside in cloud providers today. So that's point number one. When you start thinking about security, the big thing in 5G is that this is cloud. This is not your daddy's telco anymore. It's not even my telco anymore. I mean, it has changed how we build telecom networks. And look, I've been in this business over 30 years, and we have been talking about the convergence of data and voice and bringing these networks together. But yet, in the 35 years I've been here, this is the first time where we have actually delivered on the promise of convergence. Everything in 5G is built on IT technology. That being the case, we're also inheriting all of the vulnerabilities of that IT industry. We're inheriting all of the vulnerabilities that come from the internet, because 5G is built on internet technologies. We didn't introduce any telco technology in 5G. In fact, we threw all the telco away. We're using all IT tech to deliver 5G services. And so now we have to be thinking about a completely different threat vector. We got to be thinking in the same terms as we do with the internet. And CISA's done a great job here, by the way, of characterizing that and classifying where those threats are at and keeping industry apprised as to where those threats are popping up. But it does, it does introduce a different mindset into the industry. And quite frankly, there's a lot in industry that are kind of struggling with that, because this is new. This is new for telecom. It's not new for the cloud industry, because we've been doing this for a couple of decades. But for telecom industry, this is a whole new playing field.
Excellent. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right in the sense that 5G is one bigger than 4G, but it's really a completely different animal in the sense that we've broken the architecture, reset it really to be a ubiquitous standpoint from the standpoint of a cloud-based architecture, rebuilding things from the ground up essentially, and working on essentially multimodal aspects from the communications to the compute elements and kind of a restart, if you will. I would like to pivot this a little bit and now talk a little bit about the current Border Patrol and sort of the U.S. industry has put forward a lot of significant technology efforts to help the Border Patrol and as far as controlling call it the juridical line through the use of advanced technologies and to really assist the mission of the border protection. It was mentioned earlier in the fireside chat, really saying we're trying to figure out who's coming in and what are they bringing in, and kind of the essence of how we think of the wall as a system and not necessarily a structure. And I guess this is to you, Deputy Chief Ortiz. The system can potentially obviously incorporate all sorts of new and interesting technologies, whether it's IoT or the AI that we talked about earlier, not necessarily your dad's AI, but the one now is essentially collecting at the edge. As was mentioned, 70% of the information kind of lives out there. How we collect and manage all that information at the point of presence. And we can use those sensors more effectively, essentially as a collective in a regional sense. How do you see this integrating into your own workflow and mission of the border security aspect of it? And kind of what are you thinking of as that key system, if you will? What are those technologies you think are going to be your real differentiator or enable as we move forward into the next generation of this virtual wall?
Yeah, so as we look at, the entire border environment, we certainly want to have sort of this common operating picture, tell us a picture of what's happening out there. And so our hope and intent is to be able to integrate, whether it's the autonomous towers, our traditional systems that we have out there, to our mobile video surveillance systems that we have, as well as incorporate drones, our ATAC system. And so in any one given space or sector, we're able to, know what's happening south of us, because, we've always said when it's at your front door, it's probably a little bit too late. Then it really just becomes a response. And we certainly recognize as part of our strategy, it's to deter, it's to defend, it's protect, and all those things. And so, being able to incorporate all these different tools and then, allow our field commanders to make adjustments against threat and risk. As I mentioned earlier, with 19,555 agents, it's going to be very difficult for us to cover everything. And so we're going to have to leverage technology in some of these more remote areas. And so we're even looking at, the potential of deploying some of these same assets in the maritime environment, because we know as we start to build infrastructure and we start to get control of some of these areas, the cartels have very deep pockets and they're very creative. I've always said that they don't have to abide by the same rules that we have to abide by. And so they are going to make adjustments. And it's interesting because Daniel mentioned that, hey, we have to be thinking about, protecting whatever infrastructure we build out there. And, certainly the 5G network and how we leverage that is something that's going to come under attack, I think, constantly. And so I really do think us developing this common operating picture out there is going to be very, very important. And then it's going to allow us to expand our footprint considerably. I must say that when I look at from my vantage point here in the national region, I'm thinking about our partnership up on the northern border. I'm thinking about, the 2 or 3 agents I have deployed to Alaska right now. How do I provide that same level of support to them that I'm providing to the 50 or 60 agents I have in Puerto Rico, or the 600 agents I have in Arizona? And so I think what 5G allows us to do is sort of balance and level the playing field considerably, and we can focus our attention in areas where we think we have the highest threat. So really, I think it centers around that common operating picture.
Absolutely. This makes complete sense. I kind of wanted to also talk about the fact that the border is not necessarily just a physical thing anymore. Really, it's become call it a virtual concept, right? So in the presence of sort of the new and interesting cloud platforms that have created this multi-homed concept of software can live anywhere, as well as the applications that we're all aware of with either social media or e-commerce platforms, all these things that sort of cross international boundaries in a somewhat fluid way. Those obviously have some potential security concerns around, how the information is managed, how different potential vulnerabilities might be exploited. I think former Commissioner Aguilar noted earlier that sort of e-commerce in general as a concern from the standpoint of it's a hub of, we'll call it the American economy at this point. There's so much that we are vested in keeping that as a integral and secure aspect of our operation. What can we do, or what are we doing as a strategy really to work with industry to prevent, we'll say, manipulation or create an assurance of anti-tamper or some other aspect? When we're talking about our sphere of influence may actually be limited by these, we'll say, physical boundaries. I'll leave that to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I think a great way to answer that question is pulling a thread you mentioned a little bit earlier about in 5G networks, potentially 70% of data being collected at what we refer to as the edge, from environmental sensors, IoT devices, or other componentry like that. And I think it really sort of draws out this illustration that, a lot of times when we're talking about 5G, and I've seen these conversations over the last few years as the activity has ramped up, we like to draw these really neat diagrams of this is what a 5G network looks like. And you've got the core, you've got the RAN, and then you've got the end user. And those are the three little buckets of all of it. 5G, obviously, and you heard software-defined networking in terms of how a lot of functionality that was previously actual switches, or you had to have sort of centrally controlled changes to capability and user planes, and now can be controlled by software and virtualization and all that good stuff. But central to that is this concept that so much more compute, storage, and capture is happening at the edge, at the actual border system, with the thing in the hand of the Border Patrol agent than we've ever seen in any previous G or other ICT communication system before. So in some ways, the distinction right now between the core and the edge is significant in terms of how much more will be happening at the edge in a 5G enabled environment. The flip side of that is that neat little diagram of those three compartments I talked about, where we felt like before, it's okay to have untrusted stuff at the edge because that's just at the edge. It's not near the real, the core piping of the modern day internet. It's not going to touch that. So it's okay to have less trusted stuff out there. The distinction in a software-defined network is increasingly blurred between those neat little boxes that we like to all draw in diagrams over the last few years. And so you've seen a lot of decisions, and I said I wouldn't go too far down the trusted vendor hole here, but you've seen a lot of decisions in other countries, actually in the UK, reverse decisions they had about allowing certain vendors in the edge, because it's just the edge. The reality is, even with the change of what is taking place at the edge, the reality of the software-defined environment that's all happening in is this sort of segmentation ability to sequester off risk in one component is really not as easier said than done, which is why I think you've seen a lot of countries rightfully sort of back away from that. So I think understanding the different phases of the architecture, recognizing how they're blurring, appreciating just the opportunity from what will happen at the edge, but then making sure you have the right risk management strategy around that. That's really where CISA has focused a lot of our effort in terms of the partnership efforts we have with the ICT community, and then also working with the State Department in a lot of our international engagements as well.
Sure. And Dustin, if you don't mind, if I pop in here quickly, we do have one question from the audience, and then I'll just turn it back to you, Dustin, if you want to sort of wrap up the panel. But okay. The question is 5G going to be able to achieve the needed range in austere environments like 4G LTE? So I suspect that might be a good one for Deputy Chief Ortiz, but I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I think just to coach that question a little bit, I would say, what are you doing around infrastructure and other components in order to assure the agents have the connectivity aspect they need?
Yeah, so obviously satellite broadband is going to be a means to be able to cover some of these areas that are more remote. as I mentioned, our LGDS, the linear ground detection system, is going to be very, very helpful, but it's only going to be deployed in so many areas. Our more populated communities and border environments, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. But when you're talking about Big Bend or West Texas, it's going to make things much more difficult for us. So I think we're going to have to leverage, every tool out there, to include satellite broadband.
That makes sense. I guess I would just leave one final comment, since I guess we're pretty much out of time. I'll call it open mic opportunity. So if you were to address the audience at large, we've got, I think industry affiliates, we've got government folks kind of vested in sort of success of this application. What would you compel them to do, as far as what do you think are the priorities that we should be looking at, not only from your applications, but I think just from a general, if you were the one to lay out the roadmap, where would you put your eggs? So I'll start with you, Deputy Chief Ortiz.
So I was asked this question: if I had a magic wand, what are the couple of things that I would want to see? And as an operator, it's always more agents. But secondly, I would like, our partners out there, regardless of who you are, whether you're private sector industry or within the government itself, is to be thinking about, how do I provide situational awareness, whether it's at a port of entry, at an airport, in between the ports of entry. And if you are able to provide some sort of tool or effort to be able to improve that for our frontline agents, I think then we start to have real change in this border environment. So, if you can sort of base that as your foundation for moving forward, I think we will all be much more successful.
Thank you for that. Boy, I could probably go on for another 2 hours, but unfortunately we are time limited. So I will have to belay my other questions for some other venue. But I absolutely appreciate the time you all have spent with us today. It's been, I think, a really compelling conversation. I think that we not only answered some questions, but we created a lot of new interesting ones as well. So I think there's a lot of interesting threads to pull next time around. And with that, I guess I can hand it back to you, Megan.